All right. Thank you all very much for joining our sixth DeZIM talk. My name is Ramona Shah. I am the co-leader of the Migration Department at the DeZIM-Institut, which is the German Center for Integration and Migration Research. The DeZIM-Institut is doing research on the integration, migration, social peace, and conflict in immigration societies, as well as racism. This event is co-hosted by the DEE, the German Development Institute, which is represented here by our panelist Jana Kunt, and which is a leading research institute and think tank for global development and international cooperation. Today's discussion on the conflict in Ethiopia's Tigray region that started in November of 2020, unfortunately continues being very timely. The relevance of the topic goes well beyond acknowledging the urgency of the humanitarian crisis that has been unfolding. Ethiopia plays a vital role for the stability of the larger region. It has been an important refugee hub, and it is one of the priority countries for Germany's development cooperation. In fact, Germany formed a reform partnership with Ethiopia in 2019. I'm very pleased to talk about the current situation, its consequences, and potential ways forward with three experts who come from academia and humanitarian backgrounds, respectively. I welcome Jana Kunt, Abdurrahman Ahmed, and Matthijs Lerud. Thank you all very much for joining the panel. I will introduce each of you before your opening remarks, and because we have a lot of complex issues to discuss, I will keep those introductions very brief. The live audience will get a chance to submit questions to our panelists, either by using the live chat on YouTube or by sending an email to veranstaltungen@DeZIM-Institut-institut.de. This is an address that will also be shared on the YouTube chat. We will try our best to address as many questions as possible. Before we begin with the discussion, my colleague Samuel Zewdi Agos will provide us with some background information both on the current conflict and on refugee protection in Ethiopia. Samuel is a researcher at the DeZIM Migration Department also. He has a background in international humanitarian action and public health informatics, and he currently works on a project on refugee integration in Ethiopia's Gambela region. Samuel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ramona. I would like to share my screen first. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I would like to give you the background information about the conflict and the unfolding humanitarian crisis in the Tigray region. To begin with, the root cause of the conflict. The root cause of the conflict is a long-standing political tension between the current ruling coalition and Tigray People Liberation Front, TPLF. TPLF dominated the Ethiopian political landscape for nearly 3 decades with iron fist, but the persistent demonstrations between 2015 and 2018 paved the way for leadership change in the ruling coalition, bringing Abiy Ahmed, an ethnic Oromo, to the prime minister position in 2018. In this year, the new prime minister embarked on reform, opening up the political landscape for opposition parties, releasing political prisoners, and allowing media to operate in Ethiopia. Nevertheless, the reform process has been affected by power struggle within the coalition, resulting in the alienation of TPLF from the political power at the federal government. More particularly, the political crisis exacerbated after TPLF organized regional election in defense of the federal government decision to postpone the general election in July 2020. In September 4, 2020, the political crisis escalated into military confrontation after the federal government accused TPLF forces attacking its military bases in Tigray region. The conflict has quickly become very complex and involved many actors. The Provisional Administration of Tigray and Ethiopian Human Rights Commission government agency confirmed the involvement of Eritrean forces in this conflict. On top of this, the western part of the Tigray region is currently controlled by militias from Amhara, neighboring Amhara region, and some parts of the southern Tigray, some parts of the southern Tigray also is controlled by militias and security forces from neighboring Amhara region. This complex conflict has been affecting the humanitarian situation in Tigray region. I would like to quote here last week OCHA's report, quote, "The humanitarian situation in Tigray region remains critical, with reports of intensified fighting across the region, particularly in the central zone," end of quote. Nearly half of Tigray's population, estimated to be 6 million, are in need of immediate life-saving humanitarian assistance, and more than 61,000 civilians have fled into neighboring Sudan. Recently, Amnesty International and other human rights organizations also reported of atrocities committed against civilians, particularly the massacre of civilians has received wide coverage by international media outlets. The conflict also affected refugees hosted in Tigray regional state. Currently, Ethiopia has been hosting more than 800,000 refugees from neighboring countries. Among those refugees in Ethiopia, the more than 89,000 refugees from Eritrea until recently have been hosted in 4 refugee camps in Tigray region. And the country, Ethiopia, has been known for its long-standing open door policy, but the refugees have been staying for protracted period in refugee camps. To address this limbo, the government adopted Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, CRRF, into its national plan for refugee protection. The Parliament of Ethiopia also enacted a bill in 2019 aiming at facilitating long-term local integration of refugees, access to land, and other essential public services. However, so far, these efforts seem to have little impact on socio-economic integration of refugees, and the refugees also have no viable paths to citizenship. Moreover, the current crisis has been exacerbating the plight of refugees. After the destruction of 2 refugee camps in Tigray region, more than 20,000 refugees have been reported as missing. With this, I end my presentation. Back to you, Ramona.
Thank you very much, Samuel, for giving us this background and overview. So I would now like to move to the opening statements of our panelists. First, I will address Matthijs Lerut. Matthijs UNHCR in 1992 with a background in international law and has since worked as a senior protection officer, senior legal officer, and deputy regional representative in a number of countries. Since early 2020, he has been the deputy representative of the UNHCR in Ethiopia, and we are very happy to have him here. Matthijs, how does the current situation look like in the Tigray region and for those who have left?
Thank you very much. I won't be doing credit to the severity of the situation in 3 minutes, but I will try to give a brief overview. On the one hand, I'm very happy to be here. On the other hand, I'm also a little bit disappointed because I had requested government to have access to Shira, which, if you saw the map, is right in the middle of the Tigray area, and have so far not been granted this access. This is pretty much the underlying challenge of what we're dealing with. We're 4 months into this crisis, and I would just like to briefly highlight what this, because a lot of you will have been engaged in different crises, what particularly characterizes this situation. On the one hand, of course, access. It's been very, very difficult to get access for the humanitarian community, which is not just for the immediate response problem, but also just to make a simple assessment of what is going on. The eyes and ears on the ground have been extremely limited. This is not only because of security, which still remains an issue, but also of administrative procedures that make it really difficult for us to get there. This means that particularly in the beginning of this early onset of this crisis, we had a lot of unconfirmed reports, which from a humanitarian perspective is probably the most frustrating thing to have to deal with, because as a professional organization, unless to say, yes, this happened, it didn't happen. Unfortunately, a lot of these unconfirmed reports ended up being confirmed, or at least corroborated by a number of different sources, which means that the lack of access is now in itself causing humanitarian situation. What also has characterized this particular crisis is a difference in rhetoric. While the government insists that no civilians have been affected, or at least not killed by this crisis, I think it's pretty obvious to many observers that it has dramatically affected a lot of civilians, both the refugees that Samuel was talking about, and also the population in Tigray at large. We know that about 60,000 Ethiopians have fled into Sudan. Well, we also know that they were able to do that going towards Sudan. But of course, if you look at the geography of Tigray, it's very difficult for many others to flee. They cannot go to Eritrea. They wouldn't want to go to Amhara either, for obvious reasons. So they're a bit stuck. And this is what counts for what we estimate is roughly 500,000 people who are internally displaced within the Tigray region, for whom access is also absolutely critical. Of course, the presence of Eritrean forces has been raised a lot. More recently, we've seen this coming up more and more. I think there's now, even from the government itself, an acknowledgement that this is an element. It's a massive impact on the security, even close to Shira, close to Mekelle. The recent reports of the massacres that are also linked to Eritrean troops. It's an element, a completely unpredictable and extremely worrisome element within this situation. Just briefly on the 4 refugee camps that UNHCR was managing before the crisis with Eritrean refugees. They have been affected in different manner. Clearly, the access that we did not have those camps has been damaging. I mean, in terms of the regular keep up of basic structure, basic infrastructure, the delivery of water needed, regular maintenance. Food distribution was only resumed in December. So clearly our lack of presence was an issue. Fortunately, we have been able to reestablish that in Ma'ani and Adiarush, where we now have a semi-permanent presence, where partners are there setting up, again, protection services, including, importantly, gender-based violence and child protection services. But what is of much graver concern is the situation Hitsats and Shemal, because we have not had access to those two camps. There's quite credible reports, including satellite imagery, that those camps are probably entirely destroyed, and it's unlikely that any refugees will be left there. So our priority, of course, is to find those refugees. Now, Bloomberg did misquote us as saying missing. We don't really consider them missing. We consider them unaccounted for, because we have a lot of those refugees have been identified elsewhere, and it's a priority verification exercise that we're doing. We've registered them in Mekelle, in Addis Ababa, in Shira, and the army initially has started to support transporting these refugees from Shira to the other two refugee camps, where we're working around the clock to find shelter, to find additional space, which is now an absolute priority, together with government, to consolidate those people and have a roof and basic services for the refugees of Hitsats and Shemamba, which have now been announced officially closed by the government, which means that we're working together now with them on finding alternative shelters, either in Aini or Adirush or close by for those refugees. So we have to find another location. The security around those camps is still not guaranteed. They still have different reports of attacks, including the presence of Eritrean forces, which is important. One thing I think, which leads perhaps into the discussions of my panel members, is the impact this has on the larger scale, the protection space for Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia. And this is, of course, something we're concerned about. We've been advocating a lot for Eritrean refugees who are not in those camps to at least temporarily be able to live in places like Mekelle or Addis Ababa. And we've worked with government to try and, if we can help them there, rather than sending them back to the camps. Now, these discussions are still ongoing, but particularly within the context of the CRRF, looking now at finding solutions for all Eritrean refugees, we want to look at the existing framework. We want to look at the alternative to camp solutions to see if we can find ways of easing the burden on the limited space in the refugee camps. So these are things we want to discuss with the government. I want to leave it at that. I think that what is important perhaps also to understand is that even before this crisis in early 2020, there were already some government policies towards Eritrean refugees. There was a change in eligibility procedure. There was a decision to close Hitsat refugee camp. I leave it to other observers to know what that means. But clearly it is part of that discussion on what the future is of Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia. Over.
Right. Thank you so much for providing us with a lot of points to follow up on, and I think we will touch a lot of them. So our next panelist is Dr. Jana Kunt, who is a researcher at the German Development Institute. She is a development economist by training, and her research focus include migration, displacement, and social cohesion dynamics. The current research projects, for instance, relates to the CRRF implementation in the Somali region of Ethiopia. Thank you so much, Jana, for joining. So the question that I would address to you is, what is the role indeed of the CRRF in Ethiopia and beyond in the context of international migration governance?
Yeah, thank you, Ramona, for this question, and in general for being able to jointly discuss this important topic here among us. So yeah, currently the CRRF is the most important international framework that we have that guides refugee policy. And particularly in light of the increasing number of longer lasting refugee crises that Samuel also already mentioned, the relevance of local integration in creating more sustainable solutions then is very high. And while the negotiations that led up to the adoption of the CRRF were mostly taking place at international levels, now the implementation needs to be done at national and local level. So the UNHCR was then looking for partners among the major refugee hosting countries at that time to put this into practice. And here then Ethiopia came into play, where it's the second most populous country in Africa. It is a major origin, transit, and recipient country for migratory movements. And it has been seen as a stabilizing force in that region in the Horn of Africa. And it's a diplomatic heavyweight at the same time as it's shaping the policies of the African Union and of IGAD, where, for example, the headquarters of the AU is also located in Addis Ababa, and it's involved in peacekeeping missions in its neighboring countries. So there is a strategic role of Ethiopia for the international community and for the implementation of the CRRF in that context. And if we now turn to the other side, so Ethiopia at that time of these discussions had a very ambitious industrialization strategy where it needed investment and it needed to increase its foreign exchange reserves. So there were certain incentives, and Ethiopia was then very quick in announcing its 9 pledges to nationally implement the CRRF in the country, and then became one of the 15 pilot countries that implemented the CRRF nationally. And in return for that, only days after that, the Ethiopia Job Compact was announced, through which then Ethiopia received more than $500 million from the international community. And so Ethiopia took an international leading role in the implementation of the CRRF and secured by this large amounts of funding and gained international reputation in that field. But it's important to note here that it was a top-down policy and a decision that was taken at the highest political level, incentivized by financial and socio-economic reasons. And the political process then that followed was actually quite well. It functioned. So Ethiopia was a shining star, so to say, of the international community in that respect. It also co-convened, for example, the Global Refugee Forum in 2019. So it played a major role. And it's important to mention that this refugee policy continued throughout the governmental change. So even when Abiy took power, it continued to work on the implementation of the CRRF. However, even before the current crisis then erupted and before the COVID pandemic also hit the country, there was a decreased political interest by the Ethiopian government for the implementation of the CRRF. There was an increased focus on economic growth, on the IDP situation in the country. And I'll just finish here by saying that we are in challenging times, unfortunately, for international migration governance. And a part of this Ethiopian situation now, COVID has aggravated this by closed international borders, by increased nationalistic tendencies, and generally a deprioritization of refugee policy and international migration governance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jana. So we will now, with our final panelist, take a switch from taking a look from the international perspective back to the more local perspective. Abdurrahman Ahmed is an assistant professor of sociology and the director of the Institute of Migration Studies at Jigjiga University. His research on migration focuses on durable solutions for refugees and IDPs and on the diaspora. Thank you, Abdurrahman, for being here. So the question that I would like to address to you is, how is the current situation then affecting the CRRF in Ethiopia?
Thank you very much, Ramona, and thank you for having me in this wonderful panel. I will start giving a bit of a context to the question so that it can make more sense. So as indicated by my colleague, Dr. Jana from the German Development Institute, Ethiopia was not only a good and strategic partner of the EU and the West, but also Ethiopia significantly contributed to the global efforts to improve the refugee situation by adopting the CRRF and promising 9 pledges to the refugees in Ethiopia. So for that reason, Ethiopia was considered to be a beacon of hope for the global compact and a best practice for some time, for a number of reasons, actually, because the government took a number of good steps towards the implementation of CRRF. However, the implementation of CRRF in Ethiopia slowed down after the change of government in Ethiopia around 2018, mid-2018. And this is related to a number of reasons, including the fact that when the new government came into position of power, Ethiopia was already facing political and economic instabilities as a result of ethnic conflicts and continued unrest in different parts of the country that displaced a large number of people internally. Notably, the Somali region and the Oromo region alone hosted more than 2 million internal displaced people during those days. There were also restructure of the government positions, and these issues were calling for the attention of the government. Despite the fact that there were conducive environment for the implementation of CRRF, in parts of Ethiopia, for instance, the Somali regional state, where there are massive opportunities for CRRF implementation, the government at the central level did not accelerate the process of adopting secondary legislation and the directives that guide the implementation of the process. So while Ethiopia wanted to be recognized as a CRRF focusing country, the attention of the country was diverted from by these internal matters, and CRRF was not a political priority for the government. In 2020, the global pandemic have happened, and it has changed the equation globally and shifted the focus more towards health-related issues, and this was another issue that diverted the attention of the country from CRRF implementation. And now the Tigray conflict has taken place. So now the fact that this took place, on one hand, as presented by my colleagues before, the conflict itself has induced a large number of forced displacements. Reports are saying, estimates actually are saying 500,000 IDPs, because there are no exact data on the situation and the numbers of these people internally in Tigray, and also refugees have fled to Sudan, according to the latest updates. So on the other hand, the situation has resulted suspension of funds from mainly from the European Union, and this situation, also contributes to the number of factors that were already diverting the attention of the government from the CRRF implementation, and therefore it throws this Tigray situation throws the whole CRRF issue down to the bottom of the government priority, let's say a political priority ladder. So in general, the Tigray situation contributes to the number of issues that were already behind the slow motion of the CRRF implementation process in Ethiopia. I will stop there and give the platform back to you, Ramona.
Thank you very much. So I will now like to deepen the discussion on the current situation, which is the first question block. And with the first question again to Matthijs. So on February 9th, on Kunt, the UNHCR representative of Ethiopia, said that we see improvements every day. I would like to know if this is something that still rings true today, and also see if you could elaborate a little bit more about why has the humanitarian access been so complicated?
Well, it's not difficult to see improvements every day, at least small steps every day, because the situation has started out quite dire. I think the main main points of major interest was the access that we got to the 2 southern refugee camps. It's a bit difficult to describe the emotions that gave, because amongst refugees there was a sense of abandonment by the UN, by UNHCR. Why did you leave us? These are extremely difficult situations to deal with. You know, we can justify it for ourselves, but from a humanitarian perspective, and I think that one of the major fallouts of this particular crisis is the issue of trauma that all, I think, inhabitants of Tigray have gone through. This is, and it's not, it hasn't stopped yet. And so, in terms of improvement, yes, the access is improved. We do now have a permanent presence in a place called Debark, from where we visit the camps on a regular basis. We have a permanent presence in Mekelle, which is the main capital of Tigray, from where a much larger humanitarian response is being established. There is donor interest, so we're preparing the ground for a much more robust impact as soon as we do have the actual access. Why it has been difficult? It's difficult to say, because I'm not the one granting access or refusing it. And I think that there are different speculations about this. Given the intensive activity, military activity in the area, we're often diplomatically referring to unidentified armed groups, but many of these armed groups are not that unidentified. Samuel was making reference to the Amhara forces, the Eritrean forces. It's no secret that there are sort of geographic ambitions of some of these groups to Tigray, which complicates. And then, of course, we have the TPLF. And what is not so much improving is the prospect for a long drawn conflict that may not be an open conflict as we saw in the early days, but it's going to be a sort of an asymmetric warfare. And if you look at the different reports we're still getting of pockets of violence, and that is probably the worst you can imagine in terms of a situation you're trying to address, that you still will have a continuing insecurity. And it's an unpredictable one, because you don't know where it happens. You don't know where the next type of insecurity is going to be. Today, my colleagues told me that from Mekelle itself, they're closing in on Shira, is able to reach Shira from there. So yes, there is. It's on the local level. The relationships we have established with the transitional government, they're very, very keen to receive this support. They're not making many obstructions at all. They're saying, look, there is a security issue, but the UN and all our NGO partners, we're used to dealing in insecure environment. This is our job, and this is not something that we're going to be afraid of. So this is an element of hope, where as soon as we do get access to places like Mekelle, we will have a freedom of movement, because the local authorities are very much aware of the dire needs, and quite happy to support. So that is really the main priority right now, to be on the ground, to be able to access and provide tangible services to people who have been denied. I think we've heard a lot of reports of IDPs also living with not necessarily relatives, but living with others. So the host population is doing an incredible job in bringing that initial support. But everybody's in a difficult situation, and at some point reserves will run out. So the sooner we can support that effort, the better it is.
Actually, I would like to follow up on that precisely, because I'm wondering first if you could give us an update on the food situation that has been extremely difficult as well, with food ratios that were extremely hard to deliver. So I would like to understand how is that looking like at the moment, and also for different population groups. So now that you do have general access, can you take an area-wise approach, or is it that you reach particular population groups basically?
Let me first clarify, we don't have general access. There is still a procedure in place. It's true that before the weekend, there was a statement by the Prime Minister that all agencies have unfettered access. We are still trying to find out what that means, because we have been told by our main government counterpart, the NDRMC, who deals specifically with the IDP operation, that the clearance procedure is still in place. So it is a little bit difficult for us to understand exactly what has changed. There are discussions about setting up a civil military coordination cell on the ground, which would facilitate discussions there where it's necessary, because it should that process shouldn't be really managed from Addis Ababa. It would be much better if those discussions are at the field level. So access is on the main access of the main roads, which means Mekelle, Adigrat, accessibility to Shira, for instance, is still extremely difficult. So the food support that has been provided, and I'm not talking about refugees now, I'm talking about the IDPs, has been provided by government, but the international community, those types of rations still have quite significant difficulties of getting to the persons in need.
All right, thank you so much. I would now turn to Abdurrahman. We have been talking about different groups of people. We have been talking about local populations. We have been talking about refugees who were hosted in the area before, that are now facing secondary displacement within the country and outside of the country. We have been talking about IDPs. So can you give us more information on how do IDPs fit in when we think about the CRRF? In which ways are the policies included here or separated or not?
Okay, and thank you, Ramona. If I get the question, we're talking about how does the situation affect the IDPs, or?
No, how does the CRRF, I mean, it's about refugee protection. So the main target population being refugees. I'm wondering, how does the IDP, and you have been talking about, actually all of you have been mentioning that the political interest has been changing in that respect. I'm wondering how IDPs fit in when we think about the CRRF. Are they in somehow part of it? Would they be covered? Would it be completely separate frameworks here that would be in place for IDPs in Ethiopia? Right, there may be a problem with the connection. Ah, okay. Are you back?
Sorry, am I there?
Yes.
Okay, so I will continue. So by the CRRF here, we are talking about that the hosting nation of the refugees agrees to integrate the refugees locally by giving more rights, as the case of Ethiopia, offering 9 pledges to the refugees. However, in Ethiopia, and particularly in the Somali regional state of Ethiopia, we also have a large number of internally displaced people. In fact, it was one of the largest host of the internal displacements, then followed by the Oromia regional state, mainly due to the ethnic tension between the two regional states. So we have in Ethiopia a different policy called the Durable Solutions Strategy at the national level that was actually developed very recently. And that was developed out of the experience of the Somali regional state that developed the Somali regional state Durable Solutions Strategy at the regional level. So I would consider the two situations are, as a separate in this way. So CRRF mainly focusing on the refugees, whereas the IDPs have this separate strategy we call the Durable Solutions strategy, which of course at the same time includes the same options. So local integration is one option, taking them back to the previous place, the location they have displaced from is another option, and then the third one is if they agree to resettle another position, which is not the place that they have fled from. So I would see the situation this, as this separate.
Let me ask you just again to clarify. So if you have different populations with similar needs in one region, so if you have in the one region both refugees and IDPs, it would then be separate institutions who would be taking care of the needs of those population groups, or not? Yeah,
so in our case, for example, we have, for the refugees, there is a dedicated government agency called ARA, Administration for Refugee and Returnee Affairs, or agency, that solely takes the mandate, the government level mandate of dealing with the refugee issues, and all the agencies and organizations that are supporting the refugees follow that path and work with ARA. They give the permission. Whereas in the IDP cases, each regional state has their own entity that deals with the disaster risk management coordination affairs, or disaster risk management bureau. They have different names in different regions, and all the entities that has to deal with, or humanitarian actors that has to support the situation of IDPs, or the IDPs in general, go through this regional level bureaus and work with them. So for the humanitarian actors, it happens that the same organization could be working on the forced displacements, including both refugees and also the IDPs. The case of the UNHCR, that's both dealing with the refugees through ARA and also working with the internal displaced people through the regional level actors. So it happens particularly in the Somali regional state. You have IDPs and refugees sometimes in the same locations, sometimes in the same areas, people who have the same needs or the same, but the only difference is being some of them crossing the border to here. So, we have these different lines of working with the two communities, with the two, groups.
All right, thank you so much for your clarification, which will be relevant, I think, when we think about ways forward. Jana, to wrap up basically the question block on understanding the current situation, I was wondering if you could reflect on the following. So you already mentioned it, I think, that there was a lot of hope basically in the international community associated with Ethiopia, but also with the government change in 2018. Could you reflect on how the current situation fits in here?
Yeah, so yes, there was a lot of hope, which was also met first, but also not only from the CRRF perspective, but generally from the economic and political opening of the country, which would then allow for the creation of jobs, of dialogue, which is important also with respect to refugee integration. And now with the current situation, well, it's kind of a reality check, I would say, right now. We don't know what's going to happen. We have seen, as we mentioned, as Abdurrahman also mentioned, a slowing down of the process even before, and it's likely to foster this process, to rather slow down, at least from the governmental priority. And here, I believe it's a problem that it was such a process that was a top-down policy, because they forgot to really take local and regional actors on board that could now address certain problems, even though the federal level is engaged in other issues, which would mean to increase the capacities of those local actors in the Somali region, for example, to address issues of IDPs, of refugees. And yeah, it seems that now this process, that there was a lack of trickling down from the beginning, aggravates in that situation now. Additionally, I mean, we would perhaps talk about that as well. It's election year in Ethiopia, so it's likely that ethnic tensions also in other regions will increase, that those kind of regional power brokers that are all over the place will engage in social media and all over, and it's becoming an even more difficult environment to implement the CRRF.
Right. I would like to move the discussion towards focusing more again on understanding the consequences of what has been happening, and go back to Matthijs. So there are very different estimates actually on mobility patterns that have been caused so far by the current conflict. You mentioned before that you considered estimates of 500,000 IDPs, and you also mentioned how important the factor is of having the ability to move. So I'm wondering, what do we know about how and in which orders of magnitudes the situation has already affected? You mentioned internal displacement, but also international displacement, apart from the 60,000 people that you have been mentioned that already moved to Sudan. So are there other mobility patterns basically that are relevant here, or these are the two figures that we need to keep in mind, the IDPs and the people who have already moved to Sudan?
What I've learned, important parts of being able to respond proactively, is when you plan ahead. And so we've done a tremendous amount of contingency planning. There's a risk in this, because in 2020 we were contingency planning for the elections. The elections were postponed and something completely different happened that we were not really prepared for. Another big lesson to learn is that when you plan and make contingency planning figures, to not publish those figures, because there have been a tremendous amount of confusion. Just an example, at the very onset of the Tigray crisis, I think there was a figure of 9 million displaced picked up by Al Jazeera, whereas that was a planning figure of people potentially affected overall by the entirety of the conflict. And figures have a tendency of, first of all, dehumanizing the real situation, and also creating tremendous amount of confusion. Having said that, I think what I think you're asking is as well, what else can we expect in the near future? And I think that we, when we talk about refugees, we initially thought the number may be much higher. So I don't think that currently we're going to look at much more than 60,000 to Sudan. We are now also seeing another movement to Sudan from Benishangul Gumuz. There's the ethnic conflict in Metekel, where we have up to 7,000 refugees who've gone to Sudan in the Blue Nile area, which is extremely difficult to access from the other side, as well as from our side. There are tensions rising in the Oromo region, in the Somali region. I think what we need to be, and I think someone said it earlier, Ethiopia has been considered a beacon of stability in an area that can be unstable. I don't think that anyone can afford this to degenerate into something worse. I think that the stakes are so incredibly high. There's simply no option. There needs to be reason. There needs to be a way out, because 110 million people in Ethiopia deserve this, including the refugees who found shelter in Ethiopia. So it is important to prepare, to plan. When it comes to the elections, I think that is an important event. I don't think we can automatically assume that there will be problems and displacement, but we need to be ready for that. I think one of the effects of the Tigray crisis specifically has been sort of a domino effect on other situations, meaning that because of the intention on Tigray, because of the sending of military forces to Tigray, that means gaps in other areas, and so that I think that is something to be aware of. In the end, you know, and that's an appeal to the government, of course. There needs to be a process of reconciliation and a process of dialogue, because the kind of numbers that we are talking about potentially are unimaginable, and when even if you're not talking about accessibility, if you do have access to 500,000 people, you know, where do you start? So for the time being, we're still relatively conservative. I think the ongoing movement within the Tigray region, I hope we can somehow stem it by having immediate access. Certainly when it comes to the refugee situation, the fact that we now have access to those two camps, it has generated a tremendous amount of desire from the refugees that are in the surroundings to come forward and to be there. I think that's an obvious trend. If there is support, if there is assistance, then this is where people will move. People don't move for the for no reason. So that is one thing. And then the last thing I want to say about this is that what another area that we're closely watching are migration movements. Some people who wanted to come back to Ethiopia were not able to. There are lots of reports of people stuck, whether it's in Yemen, in Saudi Arabia. Some of these movements took place. Then COVID also came up and it was impossible to move. On the other hand, it may also generate additional movement out of Ethiopia. It's true that the Eritrean refugees were amongst the most mobile of refugees in Ethiopia. The huge diaspora. So many people made attempts, and often that will probably not stop. I mean, there may be some issues in terms of legal exit permits, but clearly, I think these types of instabilities or potential instabilities, I think, also do generate that type of movement of trying to find alternatives elsewhere. Over.
Yeah, thank you very much. You are making very fair points when it comes to being cautious about those type of estimates. I completely take that. And it's good that you mentioned also the gaps in other areas. We have seen reports now and how it relates to other type of migration movements, which was also what I was having in mind when talking about mobility patterns more generally. So relating to those gaps in other areas, Jana, could you talk about the EU, like the latest developments here? Because you were mentioning in another context that the development assistance for non-refugee related aid necessarily has also been affected by the current crisis. Could you explain this in more detail?
Yeah, I'm definitely not an expert on this, but yes, there was a stop of disposal of funds, particularly from the EU, which is one of the major donors or partners in this field with Ethiopia. I think you mentioned it, that it's one of those 16 priority countries for the EU to work on migration and refugees, and the EUTF, so the European Union Emergency Trust Fund, which is one of the major mechanisms here with large amounts of funds. Here Ethiopia is kind of the top, I think the third top receiving recipient of this financial support. So here they were focusing their activities previously on CRRF and also the job creation area, and they kind of put some of this on hold, as well as the US did so. And if I'm correct, they tied it previously to the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam issues, which is one of the kind of other difficult areas where Ethiopia is having problems, potential conflict with Sudan and Egypt. And now they even extended this tying of funds to the conflict resolution in the Tigray area. So this means that for Ethiopia, it might have economic consequences as well by reducing the funds of the international community, and by then not having potentially enough foreign exchange reserves, which is a problem for the country.
All right, thank you. For understanding the consequences, as to wrap up that part, I would like again to come back to IDPs and how the current figures of new IDP displacement, how it affects also the CRRF. I mean, you explained, Abdurrahman, you explained before that there are different entities responsible for taking care both of IDPs and refugees under the CRRF. But I was wondering if there's still some things we need to know to understand how both work together, or how the IDPs now are going to affect the implementation of the CRRF.
Thank you, Ramona, again. So I would say the same thing. I mean, the IDPs and refugee issues in Ethiopia in general, particularly in our case in the Somali regional state, I said, are dealt with different authorities, and therefore they go through different, planning channels. That's one thing we should keep in mind. However, our colleague Ruth was mentioning very important point when he was talking now. The specific internally displaced people in Tigray region now would mean a lot for the implementation of the CRRF in Ethiopia and in the Somali regional state, as I have mentioned. So it would mean like focus on the urgent issues, focus on the emergency crisis in the Tigray regional state, which will divert the attention of the government, but also from the donors, away from the funding and supporting maybe the CRRF in Ethiopia towards that area. Recently, we were conducting an assessment on the local integration of IDPs with IDMC, and what interestingly we came to find was that so the international organizations have to summon or raise funds so that they can implement projects for the IDPs and refugees, and they were in the process of planning, collecting kind of a joint fund for the internal displaced people, particularly for the local integration in the Somali regional state. And as they were in process of meetings with the kind of a green light already given, then the situation in Tigray happened, and then they were really worried about the fact that the attention will be now shifted away from the IDPs in other parts, or maybe even the refugees and the CRRF in other parts, towards that of the crises that are going on in Tigray. So yes, the situation means that the crisis in Tigray means focus on there, and focus on there means gaps in other areas, because in Ethiopia we have these whole huge problems which are not only the case in Tigray now, but also these were already problems that were existing in Ethiopia, the IDP issues, the refugees. Also, it's important to mention that refugees the largest numbers are hosted in 4 of the developing regional states that are, in terms of the capacity, already weak, and that cannot even support much to these people. So the situation in Tigray now would mean there will be gaps in these already, flimsy situations and capacities in the 4 regional states, and also for the IDPs as well. And back to you.
Mm-hmm. Let me come with a follow-up.
Ramona, if I may, I think
yes, please.
It's very true that there is a lack of flexibility to deal with a host of different issues. But what I do also think it's interesting, and it is something that I think we need to look at more closely, if we are talking about a link between humanitarian and development, which is of the CRRF, to what extent can, particularly when it comes to an emergency, and I'm not only talking about refugees, but IDPs as well, can we use some of the CRRF principles? Because we have this sort of jerk reaction where we still make a very distinction between emergency response and longer term integration prospects. And if I just take you one example of where now we are needing to find a new accommodation for, let's say, up to 15,000 refugees who have been displaced by the conflict. Again, we are looking at extra sites, we're looking at a refugee camp, but at the same time, using some of the gains that we have made in discussions with government. And Ethiopia, let's face it, I think they're quite proud of some of the achievements around the solutions and the out-of-camp type of principles. Now, there may be different levels of success in that, but I think the principles are there. And so why not then also build that into your immediate response, emergency response? And so why, the moment you're building a camp, why not also elaborate on, okay, what are some of the opportunities? What are some of the skills that the Eritrean refugees have, for instance, in this example, and try and perhaps expedite and build that into your response, and not automatically think of a refugee camp? What are some of the sustainable elements in that? How can the World Bank, for instance, and other actors be engaged in that? So I think it is actually a challenge, I think, that we have to see how can also that development model help us in dealing with the immediate aftermath of emergencies. Because in the end, yes, it's true, there's a lot of trauma counseling, there's a lot of immediate support needed, but at the same time, it is also about immediate economic opportunities, self-reliance. These issues are also, I think, very pertinent in this particular stage of the situation. Over.
Yeah, I'm very happy actually that you picked this up again, because I mean, you have touched upon this before also, that you are looking at different principles and see how to create synergies. At least that's what I took away here. And I think it is also a good reminder that we are looking at not only at two different populations, refugees and IDPs, but I mean, I'm not just talking about, or what I had in mind with my earlier question was not just the new IDPs that of course now require humanitarian assistance, whereas with the CRRF, we are looking more into development assistance with a longer term focus. But I was also thinking about, those IDPs who have been, not the new ones, but those who have been there also for a longer time, and I assume would deal with where those synergies are more obvious in the local context. So maybe we can come back to that actually when we are now turning to what are potential ways forward. So the last question block is really basically trying to understand as much as we can. So what can the international community do to improve the situation and to specifically avoid further atrocities? Matthijs, can I just give the mic back to you and ask you what are those factors that you think will have the greatest impact on the situation in the next couple of weeks and months?
I will copycat the same messages that I have delivered to my High Commissioner when he came here some weeks ago and spoke to the government. The government was eager to talk to him. He met the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, the President. First of all, I think it's important to dissect a little bit the issue of access, because yes, we've asked for access. What does that really mean? I think it's about simplification of procedures. It's not that we want to do away completely with procedures, because there are some regulations to follow, but move that type of decision making also to the field. I was earlier referring to the fact that at the regional level, there's a great sense of knowledge, a great sense of urgency of what's needed. Can those decisions not be discussed at that level? There are discussions of having a civil military coordination cells, which again are very operational elements where you can discuss very specifically, concretely on a daily basis, that someone says, okay, tomorrow you can go, day after tomorrow, because of this and this security incidents, you cannot. That is the type of interaction that we need from government, not something that is regulated far away from the real needs. That is extremely important. Otherwise, I think, and that's increasing now, the notion that some of the abuses are still ongoing. We have reports of specific conflict, smaller scale, but not less damaging, both in terms of the freedom of movement and the effect it has on civilians. And that's a message the High Commissioner also made very clear. In order for us to deal with this issue, in order for us to respond, the conflict must stop. There must be an outreach. There must be a dialogue. There must be a negotiation. That has been quite difficult. Much later on, at some point, we need, this is also important for everybody, a sense of peace building and transitional justice and investigation. And that's something that he has also pushed for as an important element of moving on and dealing with what's happened. But for all of that to happen, we do need to have effective access. And I think it is, as I've said earlier, I think there is a level of joint analysis and joint agreement on what the situation is. Right now, there's a big discrepancy in terms of the rhetoric. I think we need honesty on all sides, going there together and see what is actually happening and how can we deal with it. I don't think it's in anyone's interest to hide the truth. Otherwise, we cannot start dealing with some of the real issues that are happening. We've heard quite a lot of shocking stories also about sexual violence, about the use of sexual violence within this. We've seen it in other conflicts. These are issues that are super sensitive, but if we don't deal with them right now, immediately, first of all, stop them from happening, but also deal with the consequences and with the survivors. These are things that destroy not just lives but whole communities, and that is something that needs to be acknowledged. There was a start of that. The Minister of Peace mentioned that a few weeks ago. That is important. I think the acknowledgement of what's going on, because we're all here ready to help, and as I said earlier, we really don't have there's no choice that we cannot fill. But that is something that that needs to be happening. A more consistency on what, in fact, our analysis is, so that we can start responding.
Thank you. Jana, I may address the question to you then. How do you see the role? But I mean, everyone is very invited to join here with the response. So, what do you think about the role of the international community and of Germany that has formed, as we previously said, a reform partnership with Ethiopia? And as I understand that we have been shying away now for the reasons of, for different reasons, including the one that we cannot fail to provide scenarios how further instability will affect migration movements beyond Ethiopia. But what is the role that the international community can take now to contribute to not failing?
Well, I would support here, first of all the points that Mathis has made. So first of all, we need access in order to be able to support humanitarian assistance for the communities there, for the affected people. But also there needs to be investigation into certain human rights violations that might be ongoing. And I think Germany or the international community as a whole should use different diplomatic pathways to influence what's going on in Ethiopia currently, to push for inclusive dialogue. We've talked about that before. I think transition in general won't go without inclusiveness, without bringing all parties back to a table. And this includes the TPLF. And potentially also there think about the role of IGAD and the AU, where Abiy has refrained from taking on any peace initiatives coming from the African Union. And I think what is really important that the international community needs to continue the support they have established. And this includes the further implementation of the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, because if we disregard that, we kind of disregard the situation of other hundreds of thousands of people that are living in the disadvantaged or developing regions of Ethiopia, particularly also in the Gambela region, which I think was mentioned before, and further destabilize the country. And Mathis also mentioned that there are other ethnic conflicts in refugee hosting regions. So this could then aggravate the problem in general. And here, I believe, and that was mentioned before as well, a regional and local perspective is important so that you engaged with those actors. And I liked Mathis' point before to think of the CRRF now to kind of take it as a framework for solutions that you're looking into now. I wonder how this could work. And I'd like to hear also the other's perspective on the role of ARA here as a very dominant actor who is mostly acting at the national level and who would eventually lose powers if you strengthen the role of local and regional actors in fulfilling certain responsibilities and services to the refugees and IDPs. So yes, I think my main message is don't withdraw, but continue the support that has been established.
And let's just pick up on the question that Jana posed. Mathis or Abdurrahman, would you like to follow up on that? What would be the question about ARA and as well that both of you touched, the potential of applying CRRF principles now?
Just to say that, I mean, we have had an interesting relationship with ARA over the years, and I think that unique relationship, dealing with refugees only and dealing with ARA only from our end, should also be reviewed in light of the whole discussions about the CRRF, the whole of whole of system approach dealing with line ministries. Now, there has been a bit of reluctance previously, but there is a new leadership with ARA, and I think those discussions are have started up again, and I think that the broader discussions, also with the World Bank and other actors, are key. There is a willingness to discuss these issues. I mean, there's lots going on at the same time, and that's a little bit difficult. But I see this with optimism. I think that there is particularly now with what's going on in Tigray, but also with some of the other tensions. I don't think that Ethiopia is willing to give up on this. Some of the structures that need to be put in place is in terms of having, an interministerial coordination, and also I think an acknowledgement, both from ARA and NDRMC, that for many of the partners that are dealing with displacement, it is difficult to make that distinction. We really need to look at how we can come up with mechanisms to deal with issues from a person-centered approach, whether they're refugees or IDPs. And so in that sense, I think we're not going to give up on those institutions, clearly not. But the way that the institutions can work together, now they are reporting to one ministry, but I think that's not the main issue. The main issue is that how can we, as an international community, have those discussions and adjust the way that we work together, so the way that we coordinate amongst each other to the commitments that have already been made by the government. So we have a framework, and within that framework, to kind of modernize and adjust some of the collaboration mechanisms. And I think if we can show that that is in the benefit of everybody, then I think that should be feasible.
Okay, I'm happy that you are reporting to be optimistic about those talks that are ongoing. So we will closely follow. We will closely follow how those develop. I'm wondering how we find out how they develop, but I hope we will. So Abdurrahman, could you share with us some thoughts about the medium and long-term perspective for the CRRF in light of the current developments and the current discussion?
Thank you again. So I think one thing that we will all agree on is that the immediate solution for the whole situation, including the CRRF, is that now the government of Ethiopia to understand that they have the primary protection responsibility for its citizens. And while there are disagreements, there were actually disagreements and misunderstandings, shall we say, that's how the conflict arise between the TPLF and the federal government. Then they should know that again the citizens in Tigray are their citizens and their own citizens, and the government alone currently cannot deal with the crisis or emergency situation that is in Tigray. And therefore, the immediate solution is that the government agrees to the full humanitarian access. That will be one thing. In the medium, or the long term, we can then say the medium and long term solutions be an inclusive dialogue for the parties to talk, come to terms, and then see how things unfold. But that would not yield an immediate result for the time being, given the context and the situation that has taken place between the two. So another point which is important is that the international let's say community or the donors also kind of find a way to push the government to give attention to the CRRF implementation. There were already a number of reasons that we have mentioned that were slowing the process of CRRF implementation, and that with COVID-19 and then now this whole Tigray situation. So if they do not find a way to kind of push the government, give a priority to the CRRF implementation, then it will be very difficult, because Ethiopia now has a lot to deal with, a lot that's under its responsibility to deal with. And the first of all is the situation in Tigray. So maybe the international community also need to push directly or indirectly somehow and remind the government to prioritize the CRRF through different channels. Yeah, and back to you.
All right. We can basically now move slowly towards the last part of the discussion, which is basically some closing remarks for all of you. And you don't need to restrict yourself to, please don't restrict yourself to the questions and topics that we have been. I will have one more. I'm now having one audience question that is added here, so I will sneak that in a second. But all right, then we'll come to the closing remarks afterwards. So the audience question that I can ask now is, what do you think about resettlement as one part of the solution? Whomever would like to respond here. Well.
Yes, my favorite topic.
All right. In my discussions with some of the refugee leaders, the Eritrean refugee leaders in Addis, you have to believe me that in my career I got many requests, many different requests for resettlement. Some of them are realistic, some of them are not realistic. But then when I start analyzing the situation of Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia, there are certainly arguments to make for resettlement. I think there are, if we have seen what's happening particularly in Tigray, where we have heard reports of Eritrean troops specifically looking for people. We've heard reports of possible abductions, of refoulement. Again, from our end, I hope that these reports are not true. I fear that they are. But before we can start working on those, we need confirmation, and it's extremely difficult to get. And our operational capacity in Eritrea itself is also quite limited. Having said that, I think there are certain, if we look at the need itself, there are certain categories of people, journalists, activists, that will have very specific concerns in Ethiopia. So the resettlement is always on the table as a part of a solution, using it strategically. We know that we need to also manage expectations, because it's only available for very few people, but it should always be part of the menu of options. I think one thing that is interesting in that respect is that one of the largest resettlement partners for UNHCR, the United States of America, has, for reasons everybody knows, been a little bit difficult in the recent past. And what is very interesting to see is that the moment that the administration there changed, one of the first decisions, or some of the first decisions made by that administration, were around refugee resettlement. That is encouraging. I don't know where that's going to go, but I think that is certainly something we need to look into as an opportunity. Eritreans have benefited from. It's also a sensitive issue, because clearly the Eritrean government is one of the things that they've been quite unhappy about
is the resettlement of its citizens. So it's not an easy issue, but it's definitely on our agenda and needs to be included as a standard possible response also to this particular situation.
All right. Before we do need to move to the closing remarks, there's one last audience question that I think we can manage to address here, which concerns, this one was, the previous one was submitted by Markus Engler. This one here is submitted by Hassan Tahir, which who also stresses, like you were doing before, that one of the main things in the aftermath of conflicts is the assessment of responses and damages to move ahead. But he's saying that this is not the case in Ethiopia. So his question would be, now we all agree that this is something that needs to happen, but how? How do we now make sure to move towards that solution? Who would be the ones who need to do that and who need to be watched to do that?
Can you clarify? You mean I didn't get the assessment of damages, or are you talking about the
acknowledgement of the aftermath? Is an acknowledgement in the aftermath of conflict, what you were touching on before precisely, so that the international community prepares an assessment for the response to the damages. But unfortunately, that does not seem to be the case in Ethiopia, which hinders any viable aid. So how do we, and who does come up with a viable solution? I think the way I understand this question is that it basically relates to what you were mentioning before, which is this transitional justice and acknowledging what was happening and looking into those abuses. So providing this honesty on all sides. So who would be the ones who need to take that? There has been some initial acknowledgement, but how do we take that, or who does take that a step further? Who is involved in taking that further?
There is a really interesting dilemma, and I'm talking to some, at least, of you are academics that can help us with that. In terms of the notion of stopping violations and addressing the immediate aftermath and transitional justice. And as an international human rights lawyer, I'm fully aware of the necessity of transitional justice, but I also think that there's a time and a place and an actor for that. And so UNHCR, our mandate is clearly we are engaged in the verification of refugees, particularly those that are unaccounted for. But the process of doing investigations will be somewhere else, and that is something that where the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights has a role to play. There are reports going out now, as also referenced by Samuel, where I think the government has been quite clear that they don't accept the information that is provided in those reports. All of that calls for a clear independent investigation, and that's something that we have appealed to. The High Commissioner has done so. He also given options that if Ethiopia doesn't want to have a completely independent investigation, at least, in the work with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, try and integrate into that structure independent and international experts, for instance. I mean, there are different ways of approaching it. I think it is unthinkable not to take that step, and I think that's what if you talk about what the international community can do, put pressure, I think that is absolutely necessary to move on in order for some kind of truth and reconciliation and to know what has happened and make those repairs. The main question is who, and it's a good question, who's going to do it? I think as long as Ethiopia is going to do it all by itself, as a party to the conflict, I think there will be an issue of credibility in the international scene. And so the more any process that can be agreed on will integrate international expertise and a form of independence and transparency. These are based on negotiations, and there is already at high level quite a bit of pressure of how that would be organized. At least from the UN perspective, it would definitely be the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. They have been quite active. They have made a number of statements as one of the few agencies from the very beginning, and have been consistently doing that. So that would be, at least from the UN family, the partner that we would rely on.
Thank you. So we do now, due to time, need to move to the closing remarks. I thank you all very much. So I would like to give each of you, starting with Jana and Abdurrahman and Matthijs, the opportunity to close with a few sentences on what would you want people to take away from this event. Thank you.
Yes, thank you also from my side again for this discussion. It was very interesting. And what I would like people to take away is, first of all, that to acknowledge that it's very likely that this conflict will take longer than most of us hope, and that we need to accept that ethnic tensions are kind of historical heritage of the country, and we need to deal with that, particularly also as international community, while still being active there. And this is the second point, that while the focus has been very much from the international community, but also by the government on the conflict in Tigray right now, there are other pressing issues in that country that we need to focus on in order to not destabilize it further. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and I'll try to make it very brief and short. And I would emphasize on the fact that there is a dire humanitarian situation in Tigray, and therefore the government needs to understand that it's part of its responsibility to give the access, full access. Let's say there have been claims that there were UN missions or other entities that were given permission, but full humanitarian access, to my knowledge, is yet pending. So the government needs to permit that, so that people can be supported, or the situation that now is considered to be a total disaster can get at least a response, and it doesn't get worse. It doesn't worsen as the time goes by. And the second point that I would like to make clear is suspension of the fund is, to my understanding, is not also a solution at this point that the international community and the donors are doing. So they need to consider that Ethiopia is also hosting other refugees in other parts of the country, and also there are IDPs in the country, and suspending the funds would only worsen the situation both in Tigray and in the other parts of Ethiopia. So instead of suspending these funds, maybe putting some other pressure or indirectly engaging the UN or the African Union to find solutions would be a better for the conflict situation and the overall situation in Ethiopia. And also one possible thing is, instead of suspending funds, maybe also the international community needs to put kind of a criteria instead of suspending CRRF, for instance, implementation of CRRF for the government as maybe criteria, so that after coming back of this situation, they do not forget it outright. And I will stop it here. Back to you.
Shall I? Yeah. I think in the end, it is a question of trust and a question of dialogue. Today is in Ethiopia the celebration of Atwa, where the Ethiopians celebrate the victory over the Italians. It's a long time ago, but this is a very capable and very proud country. And I think that we have, and we're talking about the CRRF, we're talking about some of the gains made. I think it is a question of mutual trust. I think that we need to understand the immense complexities that the government is facing with. And the government needs to understand that we're only here to support this. And as I said earlier, I think none of us can afford this to fail. I think that the stakes are too high, and everybody needs Ethiopia to continue to be have that level of stability. It sounds a bit naive because I think the stakes are very high, and it is an extremely complex situation. But if there isn't that trust that we are working on the same thing and trying to reach the same thing, and particularly when it comes to the literally hundreds and thousands of individuals that are affected, not in a little way, I mean, really existentially by this, there is an urgency to deal with it. And this is where politics have to, get a bit of a second step. So I think it's that, that element that has been missing a little bit in terms of coming together and coming up with a joint solution on both ways. And I think I've again, as my representative had said, there are some areas of improvement. We need to continue that. But I think the most important part is to create this understanding with the same. And in that sense, I agree with Abdurrahman. I think it's tempting to punish, but I think that it's a statement. It's an important statement, and it perhaps says the right thing, but maybe linking that to something again that does not build the kind of trust and confidence that we need now to deal with this. And so I think that is extremely important. I know the EU has also sent its sort of an envoy. The statements that he made also didn't get down very well. I think it should not be an element of sending out statements between the Prime Minister's office and EU envoys or whoever else is going to. I mean, the US embassy, the US government, lots of statements. But is there actual? I mean, I guess there is, but looking at the type of statements that are floating around in the ether, it does not seem that there is a lot of constructive dialogue. But if there was, I mean, these kind of statements would perhaps be a little bit more constructive on all sides. And I think that's something that I would like to see more of.
All right, thank you all very much, and thank you for staying a little bit longer with us. I'm very happy that we did have this conversation. I'm grateful for all of the panelists. I'm grateful for the audience who joined. We got some few questions that we received late, and we weren't then in the end able to address all of them. I apologize for that. Thank you for the German Development Institute who did co-host this event, and for the Öffentlichkeitsarbeit at DeZIM who did a very great job of preparing this. With that, I say thank you and goodbye.